Hello everybody and welcome to the Thursday edition of Video Clips. And I guess I always am shy about bringing up anything regarding politics and elections because that generates so much backlash. But then I was reading my comments this morning, and it seems that just showing up every Tuesday and Thursday generates a lot of backlash and hate mail. So why bother to try to avoid it, right? So I'm going to go on ahead and talk about something a little bit political. I have done several video clips over the last couple of years about this freedom of speech issue and the attempt to force people to vaccinate their kids and to force drug people and commit them to mental institutions and this sort of thing. I'm opposed to that type of behavior. And there are some other things going on in terms of politics right now that I think we ought to be diligent about. The first thing is I would tell you to look into the voting records of some of your elected local officials first. Are these people who are voting for mandatory vaccinations and that sort of thing? And then look into what a lot of the presidential candidates are really saying right now. And I'll just point out one thing that I think would be an example of why you need to do this. I personally would never vote for Elizabeth Warren for whatever that's worth. I don't like her. I don't like this stunt that she pulled about being Native American and all that sort of thing, and I disagree with her on a lot of topics. But the thing that makes Elizabeth Warren the most threatening in terms of my ideas and what I'm trying to do is one of the things that she wants to do if she's elected president is get rid of schools like ours. She does not like proprietary schools and trade schools and alternative schools because she thinks that the government should control all education and all schools like ours should be eliminated. Now, to be fair, there definitely have been some problems with schools, private schools and proprietary schools in the past. They're not all good actors, just like I don't know a profession where everybody's a good actor. I know a lot of really wonderful, dedicated teachers, and I have some friends who are wonderful, dedicated teachers. But, every year in the state of Ohio, they take teaching licenses away from teachers who have sex with their kids and that sort of thing. So there are bad actors in every group and in every group of companies and institutions and that sort of thing. So in any case, I won't get into much about candidates. I'm only using Warren as an example. But before you get all geeked up about some of these people and their personalities and that sort of thing, it's sometimes a good idea to look into what are the things that they really want to do. Because I can make a pretty strong argument that there is a lot lacking in healthcare education today, and that getting rid of schools like ours would be one of the major impediments to education and healthcare changing. We would end up seriously with the status quo and no hope to ever change it if there cannot ever be any competitive schools. So I'm just giving you some food for thought. And again, I don't tend to have a lot of party affiliation. That's not my game. I look at policies of people. That's what I really evaluate. And I have a lot of reasons to be concerned about her, but this is a big one. We own a school here. We've invested a lot in what we do here and a lot of time and energy in growing this thing, and it would be pretty devastating to us and to a lot of our students if this school went away. All right, so while we're on the topic of government and fun, today's message and an article will deal with that. Every 5 years, the United States Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services appoints a committee to review and update the dietary guidelines for Americans. So this year, 2019, the guidelines are due to be updated and another committee has been appointed. It's good to have an understanding of how this process affects the diets and health of our population and how the process can lead to a lot of misinformation and why it sometimes is so confusing for people to figure out what the heck am I supposed to eat. Well, according to the USDA's website, the work product from the Dietary Guidelines Committee, quote, reflects the current body of nutrition science, helps health professionals and policymakers guide Americans to make healthy food and beverage choices, and serves as the science-based foundation for vital nutrition policies and programs across the United States. Well, it would be great if it did reflect the current body of nutrition science, but sometimes that's not the case. But nonetheless, this is pretty important, isn't it? And this is why we need to remain extraordinarily diligent in insisting that the dietary guidelines are as accurate as possible. I don't think we can get to totally accurate, and I think you'll understand why by the end of this little broadcast. The best result that we've ever achieved after testimony, lawsuits, and political pressure is that the final product is less inaccurate than it might have been. That's not a great outcome for sure. So let me tell you what happened during the last go-round, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. The last update was in 2015, and the guidelines stated that cholesterol was no longer, quote, a nutrient of concern. Well, how did this happen? Well, according to documents obtained by the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, or PCRM, under the Freedom of Information Act, the American Egg Board nominated one of the members of the committee. Another member was receiving research grants from the egg industry, and two others were employed by a university that had received over $100,000 in research grants from the American Egg Board specifically to conduct research that could refute the guidelines that recommended the limiting of dietary cholesterol. Fortunately, PCRM is quite tenacious and managed to put enormous pressure on the government to change its recommendations. Dr. Neil Barnard, president of PCRM, presented testimony to the National Institutes of Health stating that the committee had made an error on the cholesterol issue and that telling Americans that dietary cholesterol was no longer important in the final guidelines was, quote, not scientifically defensible. To put pressure on the government, PCRM purchased billboards with the headline "Cholesterol Kills" and sent a letter to Agriculture Committee Chairman Representative K. Michael Conaway, who held a congressional hearing concerning the committee's, quote, concerns with the process of developing the dietary guidelines. PCRM also informed the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Sylvia Matthews-Burwell and USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack that the group would file a lawsuit if the warnings about dietary cholesterol were weakened in the final guidelines. PCRM did follow through and filed just such a lawsuit on January 6th of 2016. Well, the effort and pressure on the government resulted in success. The guidelines included an even stronger warning about dietary cholesterol than before, stating, quote, as recommended by the Institute of Medicine, individuals should eat as little dietary cholesterol as possible. Strong evidence from mostly prospective cohort studies, but also randomized controlled trials, has shown that eating patterns that include lower intake of dietary cholesterol are associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, and moderate evidence indicates that these eating patterns are associated with reduced risk of obesity. Dietary cholesterol is only found in animal foods such as egg yolk, dairy products, shellfish, meats, and poultry. Well, that's a pretty strong warning, so job well done. Well, unfortunately, before this change was made, articles were appearing in medical journals reporting that the committee had finally realized that cholesterol was not important and celebrating the development that we were going to relax the cholesterol guidelines. And I did some research online. I found a lot of these types of articles and editorials, and many promoters of animal foods diets are still citing these outdated editorials as evidence to support, if you could call it evidence, to support their advice to eat a lot of animal foods and saturated fat. So once this stuff gets out there, people can cherry pick what they want, the point they want to make, and find studies that will support it. And this is why just citing research doesn't really do it. You have to really look at the research that's being cited and see if it's relevant or correct and that sort of thing. Well, the dietary guidelines regarding cholesterol ended up being okay, but the committee completely ignored issues associated with eating a high-fat diet, stating that healthy diets can contain up to 35% of calories from fat, and also the statement that replacing saturated fat with carbohydrate does not reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, I have written a lot of articles about this. I've created video clips about this. I've created workshops about this, and I'm not going to try to duplicate all of that here. Go in the library, read the articles, you'll see what I'm talking about. But I can assure you that this statement is not true. Diets including up to 35% of calories from fat increase the risk of many conditions like type 2 diabetes, coronary artery disease, etc., and health improves when saturated fat is replaced with carbohydrate from whole plant foods. In other words, a lot of times the comparison group in some of these studies are people who are eating toaster pastries. Those are high carbohydrate foods, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about sweet potatoes and squashes and rice and beans, those types of carbohydrate foods. Once the guidelines are finalized and published, with all of their glaring inaccuracies, government agencies and professional associations get to work ostensibly to make sure that the guidelines are utilized in practice. Typically, one of the first organizations to jump on board is the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which usually issues a statement that can best be described as a love fest with all of the committee's recommendations. So here's what the A&D posted on its website in support of the 2015 guidelines, which included the inaccurate statement about dietary fat. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics commends the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Agriculture for creating 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans that are based on a thorough review of the strongest available scientific evidence to improve how and what Americans eat. The 2015-2020 Dietary Guidelines provide crucial science-based information for health professionals to use in helping consumers make healthy choices for themselves and their families. I want you to remember, this is America's dietitians talking, right? They will provide a solid basis for federal nutrition policy, identify future research needs, and equip health professionals and employers with the tools necessary to benefit the public. The guidelines affect every Academy member, every registered dietitian, nutritionist, and every dietetic technician registered. On behalf of the entire Academy, the President says, I want to extend special thanks to the 5 Academy members who served on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and the many Academy members working in HHS and USDA whose expertise and hard work paved the way for the development of the Dietary Guidelines. And then this goes on, I won't read the whole thing to you, but it goes on about the exhaustive scientific search that they did and all of the great research that they did and how this is such a great thing. Well, anyway, at the end it says, the Academy and our members look forward to helping all Americans by translating the nutrition science and government recommendations into practical information for consumers and communities alike. There are no comments in this love fest that I just read excerpts to you about the inaccurate statements about dietary fat. Notice that 5 Academy members served on the Dietary Guidelines Committee, and I could find no evidence that they disagreed with this inaccurate statement that the President put on the website. I also could find no evidence that any of those 5 members disagreed with the fat recommendation specifically or took issue with the cholesterol recommendation that was issued before PCRM got involved and screamed and hollered and filed a lawsuit and got the corrections made. Why would this be? Well, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics is as conflicted as the Dietary Guidelines Committee. The organization's national sponsor is the National Dairy Council, and in 2017, the A&D reported receiving $2,434,857 in advertising and sponsorship revenue. That's a lot of money to buy the opinions of dietitians, right? So what's happened since these guidelines were issued? Well, before I go on, I just want to say I have to make this comment. My problem is not with dietitians. We have some great ones here. My problem is with this organization and the institution that the dietitians are forced to belong to. The dietitians I know and work with are as angry about what I just read to you as I am. Okay, so the problem isn't dietitians, the problem is the institution here. All right, so what's happened since the guidelines were issued? Well, I just read an article a couple of days ago. Americans are eating more eggs, which means that they're eating more cholesterol. In fact, more eggs than they have for the past several decades, about 279 eggs per year per person. Now, I didn't eat any last year, so somebody ate mine. Many of you didn't eat any, so somebody ate yours, all right? But the average is 279 eggs per year for every man, woman, and child in the United States. That's 95 million dozen eggs in the United States last year. Many people and organizations promoting egg consumption and celebrating the increase in per capita intake are citing the old dietary guidelines that later got changed concerning this cholesterol. So they're going back and they're finding outdated editorials to support their stance that eggs are good for you, there's no reason to be concerned about the cholesterol. Meanwhile, new studies continue to show that dietary cholesterol and egg consumption increase the risk of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. Interestingly enough, and I checked this out, the eggs don't meet the FDA's criteria for being labeled as healthy because they exceed FDA's criteria for fat and cholesterol content. So, I mean, just the whole thing is crazy, right? The entire process that I've just described to you is just hard to believe, but I'm going to summarize it for you. A group of conflicted people who work for industry are appointed to develop dietary guidelines for Americans. The guidelines often have no scientific basis. Corrections are only made when lawsuits are filed, and even then only some of the glaring errors are made right. America's dietitians participate in the process and then announce that the inaccurate guidelines are fabulous and that members of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics will be working hard to make sure that Americans know how to incorporate the inaccurate guidelines into their daily eating habits. Agricultural groups and food companies use the guidelines to promote their products, sometimes misrepresenting the final version in order to do so. Nobody does anything about that. Diets get worse, as is evidenced by the increase in egg consumption that I just reported to you. Health declines, healthcare costs increase nationally. We then engage in discussions about who's going to pay for the disaster. That's what all the single payer and all that's all about. We're always talking about how we're going to pay for the mess, not how we're going to solve the mess. And that's an important thing to remember. And then the whole process begins all over again. And that's what we're getting ready for this year. And so I'm sure it'll be very interesting. I'm sure it'll be maddening. I'm sure it'll be inaccurate. I'm sure I'll have lots to say about it this year. But if this is a lesson in how the government makes things worse, and I'm going to come back to how I started this whole thing about paying attention to politicians and what they're saying. We have a lot of people running for office right now that think the answer to everything is more government, more workers, bigger agencies, government taking over more and more and more and more of what goes on in daily life. Here is Exhibit A for why that is a bad idea, a very bad idea, all right? I'm not pretending to have all of the answers, but here's one thing that I can say with a great deal of assurance. If you keep on doing what you've always done, you're going to keep on getting what you've always got. And if you want more of this nonsense, let's get these big buildings in Washington filled with about another 500,000 people and see how that makes things better. All right? So anyhow, food for thought. All right? That's all for today and all for the week. As usual, hit the subscribe button, then pass this on to anybody else who you think would enjoy watching it, and I'll be back with you next week with more news.